What if China invaded Taiwan in 2027? The world's most dangerous scenario starts with an island most people have never visited. Why 2027 keeps appearing? The year 2027 has become one of the most uncomfortable dates in modern geopolitics because it sits at the intersection of ambition, capability, and fear. It is not a confirmed invasion date. It is not a prophecy. It is a military readiness marker that has hardened into a global anxiety. The reason is simple. Senior American intelligence and defense assessments have repeatedly pointed to Chinese leader Xi Jinping instructing the People's Liberation Army to be ready by 2027 for a successful operation against Taiwan, while also warning that readiness does not automatically mean a decision to invade. That distinction matters, but it does not make the date harmless. A military ordered to be ready for war is still a military preparing to make war possible. For Beijing, Taiwan is not just territory. It is legitimacy, history, nationalism, and strategic geography compressed into one island. The Chinese Communist Party has never ruled Taiwan, yet it claims Taiwan as part of China and has refused to renounce the use of force. Every year that Taiwan remains democratic, armed, technologically indispensable, and politically separate makes the question sharper. For Washington, Taiwan is not formally an ally in the way Japan or South Korea are, but it is a democratic partner, a military flashpoint, a symbol of American credibility, and a central node in the global semiconductor system. That ambiguity is deliberate. It is also dangerous. Strategic ambiguity works until both sides start testing what the ambiguity really means. For Taipei, 2027 is not an abstract think tank date. It is a deadline hanging over defense planning, civil resilience, energy security, drone production, missile procurement, and political unity. Taiwan's government has been pushing to lift defense spending, modernize its forces, and invest in asymmetric systems such as drones, missiles, surveillance, and coastal defense. Though domestic politics has complicated parts of that effort, a realistic Taiwan war scenario in 2027 would not begin with one dramatic moment. It would begin with pressure. More aircraft crossing median lines, more ships operating around the island, more cyber intrusions, more legal warnings, more propaganda, more exercises that look slightly less like exercises each time. The world would be told not to panic. Markets would be told to remain calm. Governments would say they are monitoring the situation. Shipping firms would reroute quietly. Insurance premiums would rise before the first missile landed. That is how modern crises begin. Not with certainty, but with deniability. The opening move, January 2027, would feel tense but manageable. Chinese military aircraft would increase activity around Taiwan. Coast Guard vessels would begin more aggressive patrols near Taiwan's offshore islands. Chinese state media would accuse Taipei of crossing red lines. Beijing would insist that all of this was routine. In this scenario, the first month is not an invasion. It is a shaping operation. China would want to exhaust Taiwan before the shooting starts, force the United States to reveal its intentions, test Japan's language, probe financial markets, and measure how quickly allied governments can coordinate under pressure. February would bring cyber pressure. Taiwanese ministries, ports, telecoms providers, power systems, media platforms, and financial institutions would face escalating attacks. Some would be disruptive. Others would be psychological. The objective would not only be to break systems, but to break trust in systems. The cyber dimension matters because a Taiwan crisis would not be limited to Taiwan. American agencies have already warned that Chinese state-sponsored actors have compromised critical infrastructure environments, with particular concern that such access could support disruption during a future crisis. In a 2027 conflict, cyber attacks against ports, energy, communications, and transport would be part of the opening battlefield. March would look like escalation disguised as legal enforcement. Beijing could announce expanded inspection zones, aviation warnings, military exclusion areas, or anti-separatist enforcement actions. The language would be bureaucratic. The effect would be coercive. Ships approaching Taiwanese ports would have to decide whether to comply, reroute, or risk confrontation. This is the crucial ambiguity. China might not begin with a D-Day-style amphibious assault. It might begin with a quarantine, blockade, or partial closure designed to force Taiwan into political submission without immediately triggering a full American military response. That would place Washington in a nightmare position. Act too slowly, and Taiwan is strangled. Act too quickly, and America may be accused of firing the first shot. By April, the world would be standing on a fault line. Flights would be cancelled. Container schedules would be disrupted. Energy traders would price in panic. Semiconductor customers would begin calling suppliers, governments, and each other, asking the same question in different words. How long can Taiwan keep producing? The invasion begins. May 2027 is when the scenario turns from pressure to war. China announces large-scale exercises around Taiwan. But this time the exercises do not end. Rocket forces move to high alert. Amphibious units gather. Civilian roll-on, roll-off ferries are requisitioned. Missile units disperse. Naval formations push east and south. Satellites begin watching each other with predatory intensity. Then the first strikes come. They would likely target air bases, radar systems, command centers, missile batteries, air defense nodes, naval facilities, communications infrastructure, and political leadership sites. The goal would not simply be destruction. It would be paralysis. China would want to blind Taiwan, isolate Taiwan, terrify Taiwan, and convince Taiwan's military that resistance is hopeless before the main landing force arrives. But Taiwan would not be passive. A serious Taiwanese defense plan would rely on survival, dispersal, and denial. Aircraft would be sheltered or moved. Mobile missile launchers would hide. Drones would hunt ships and landing craft. Mines would threaten beaches and ports. Small units would prepare for urban combat. Civil defense networks would attempt to keep communications alive. This is where the invasion becomes brutally difficult. Taiwan is not an empty chess square. It is mountainous, urbanized, heavily populated, and separated from China by one of the most politically dangerous bodies of water on Earth. Amphibious invasions are among the hardest operations in warfare, and Taiwan's defenders only need to make the crossing, landing, and reinforcement process too costly to sustain. War games have repeatedly shown this basic reality. In a major public war game of a Chinese amphibious invasion, the United States, Taiwan, and Japan usually prevented China from conquering Taiwan, but at enormous cost. Major ship losses, aircraft losses, heavy casualties, a devastated Taiwanese economy, and long-term damage to American military power. Victory, in this scenario, is not clean. It is survival through wreckage. June would become the decisive month. China would try to establish lodgements, seize ports and airfields, and fly or ship in follow-on forces. Taiwan would try to destroy landing craft, disrupt logistics, and prevent the first wave from becoming a sustainable occupation force. The first 10 days would matter more than almost anything else. If China captures a major port intact, the war changes. If Taiwan destroys enough landing ships, fuel supplies, and command nodes, the invasion begins to stall. If America intervenes directly, the war becomes a Pacific-wide military crisis. If America hesitates, Taiwan may be forced to fight alone long enough for hesitation to become history. This is the terrible geometry of a Taiwan invasion. Everyone would know the first days matter. Nobody would know how far the next escalation goes. The Pacific erupts. July would test the United States. Washington would have several options, none of them safe. It could provide intelligence, weapons and cyber support without directly entering combat. It could strike Chinese naval forces attacking Taiwan. It could deploy submarines, bombers, and carrier groups into the theater. It could try to break a blockade. It could coordinate sanctions while avoiding direct fire. But a Taiwan war does not give America unlimited time for elegant decision-making. If Taiwan's ports are closing, airfields are damaged, and political leadership is under threat, the choice becomes compressed. The United States either helps Taiwan, while Taiwan can still resist, or it risks arriving too late to change the outcome. The American response would also depend on geography. Guam, Okinawa, the Philippines, Japan, carrier groups, and undersea forces would become critical. Chinese planners know this, which is why the conflict would not remain neatly inside the Taiwan Strait. Any serious Chinese campaign would need to deter, delay, or degrade American intervention. That means American bases could be threatened. Ships could be targeted. Satellites could be jammed. Cyber attacks could hit logistics systems. Communications could be disrupted. The entire Western Pacific would become a contested operating environment. Japan would then face its own historic decision. A Taiwan conflict is not remote from Japan. It sits near Japan's southwestern islands, close to sea lanes, air routes, and American bases hosted on Japanese territory. Japan's defense documents have repeatedly described peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait as important to Japanese security and the wider international order. In this scenario, Japan does not need to launch an invasion or declare war to become central. It could provide base access, missile defense, logistics, intelligence, evacuation support, maritime patrols, and rear area protection. But the moment Japanese territory or U.S. forces in Japan are attacked, the crisis changes again. That is the chain reaction Beijing would have to fear. An attack on Taiwan could pull in America. An attack on American forces could pull in Japan. A wider regional war could pull in Australia, the Philippines, South Korea, and European support structures in different ways. China might start the war to isolate Taiwan, only to trigger the largest coalition response in Asia since 1945. August would therefore be the month of widening risk. The Pacific would no longer feel like a region preparing for conflict. It would feel like a region already inside one. Economic shockwaves. The economic war would begin almost immediately, but by September it would become unavoidable. Financial markets would not wait for military clarity. They would price fear first and ask strategic questions later. A Chinese attack on Taiwan would hit the world through several channels at once. Sanctions, shipping disruption, semiconductor disruption, insurance shocks, energy rerouting, currency volatility, supply chain panic, export controls, and capital flight. It would be a military crisis that behaves like a financial crisis, an energy crisis, and a technology crisis at the same time. A blockade alone could cause damage on the scale of a global recession. Analysis cited by Chatham House has warned that a Chinese air and sea blockade of Taiwan could trigger a 5% fall in global GDP, while a wider US to China war could push the hit close to 10%. Those numbers are not background detail. They explain why Taiwan is not just a strategic problem. It is a global economic pressure point. The Taiwan Strait is not only symbolic water, it is a commercial artery. CSIS estimates that in 2022, 32% of Japan's imports and 25% of its exports passed through the strait, worth nearly $444 billion, while South Korea depended on the strait for 30% of imports and 23% of exports, worth about $357 billion. A war in this corridor would instantly become a trade shock for some of the world's most advanced economies. China would also be economically exposed. Beijing could try to weaponize dependence, restrict exports, punish companies, control shipping, retaliate against sanctions, and use its manufacturing position as leverage. But it would be trying to coerce a global economy in which China itself remains deeply embedded. That creates a paradox. China might launch the crisis to resolve a political question, but the act of launching it could accelerate the very decoupling Beijing fears. Western governments would freeze assets, sanction banks, restrict technology transfer, reroute supply chains, and treat Chinese exposure as a national security problem rather than a cost-efficiency advantage. By October, boardrooms would be asking questions once reserved for war cabinets. Can production continue without Taiwanese chips? Can shipping routes avoid the Taiwan Strait? Can insurance cover Pacific risk? Can Chinese suppliers still be trusted? Can factories survive without components that were once ordered casually and delivered invisibly? Modern globalization was built on the assumption that the most efficient supply chain was usually the best supply chain. A Taiwan war would destroy that assumption in weeks. The semiconductor crisis. The semiconductor crisis would be the psychological center of the war. Taiwan's factories are not just factories. They are part of the operating system of modern life. Taiwan accounts for over 60% of global foundry revenue and more than 90% of leading-edge chip manufacturing, according to U.S. commercial guidance. That makes Taiwan central to smartphones, data centers, AI accelerators, vehicles, weapons systems, cloud computing, industrial machinery, and consumer electronics. TSMC is the key name, but the issue is bigger than one company. The global chip industry depends on dense ecosystems of extreme precision: power, water, chemicals, gases, engineers, lithography equipment, suppliers, packaging, testing, shipping, and trusted customer flows. You cannot simply pick up that ecosystem and move it over a weekend. TSMC has expanded internationally, including major investment in the United States, but the company has also reaffirmed Taiwan's continued importance as a manufacturing and research hub. Its leadership has stressed that Taiwan remains indispensable to its operations, even as overseas expansion grows. In a 2027 invasion scenario, the first semiconductor shock would be uncertainty. Are fabs physically damaged? Is power stable? Are engineers safe? Can wafers move? Can materials arrive? Can customers receive finished chips? Can export controls still be enforced? Can China capture facilities intact? Would Taiwan America or the company itself deny access rather than allow the most advanced capacity to fall under Beijing's control? Those questions would freeze industries far beyond technology. Car plants would slow. AI infrastructure projects would pause. Defense contractors would seek priority access. Cloud providers would hoard capacity. Consumer electronics launches would be delayed. Industrial firms would discover that invisible chips had become visible only when they disappeared. November would be the month the world realizes this is not merely a Taiwan problem. It is a hierarchy problem. Governments would decide who gets chips first. Defense, energy, telecoms, and critical infrastructure would move to the front. Luxury electronics, discretionary devices, and lower-margin consumer products would be pushed back. The semiconductor crisis would also reshape power. Countries with domestic manufacturing capacity would gain leverage. Countries dependent on imports would discover vulnerability. Companies with stockpiles would survive longer. Companies built on just-in-time assumptions would be exposed. This is the hidden reason Taiwan matters so much. It is not only a place where chips are made. It is a place where the future is rationed. Cyber attacks and the invisible front. A 2027 Taiwan war would be the first great conflict in which the invisible battlefield might shape the visible one before most civilians understand what is happening. Cyber attacks would not be a side plot. They would be part of the main campaign. China would likely target Taiwan's command systems, media ecosystem, financial networks, telecoms, transport systems, energy grid, and emergency services. Some operations would be designed to disrupt. Others would be designed to confuse. A false evacuation alert, a fake surrender message, a manipulated video, a banking outage, or a port scheduling failure could all create real-world military consequences. Taiwan would also hit back, directly or indirectly. It has strong technical talent, a sophisticated digital society, and deep relationships with partners. Its objective would not only be to keep systems functioning, but to preserve public trust. In a crisis, citizens need to know which message is real, which instruction is official, and which image is fake. The United States would face cyber pressure at home. If Chinese-linked actors had already positioned themselves inside parts of critical infrastructure, even limited disruption could create political shock. A port outage in California, a power incident in Guam, a railway disruption, a telecoms failure, or a financial system attack would not need to be catastrophic to influence public opinion. The most dangerous cyber attacks would be those calibrated below the threshold of obvious war. Beijing might want Americans to feel pain without creating enough certainty for immediate retaliation. That gray zone is where cyber becomes politically powerful. It creates doubt, delay, and argument. By late 2027, governments would be fighting not only over territory, but over reality itself. Every image of a burning ship would be questioned. Every speech would be clipped and reframed. Every casualty claim would be disputed. Every market rumor could move billions. In the old world, war propaganda traveled through posters, radio, and newspapers. In this world, it would travel through hacked feeds, synthetic media, anonymous accounts, compromised routers, and algorithmic panic. Space warfare above the strait. Above the Taiwan Strait, another war would unfold silently. Satellites would track ships, aircraft, missile launches, communications, weather, troop movements, and electronic emissions. Modern war depends on space, and both sides know it. China would try to blind or degrade American and Taiwanese awareness. That could involve jamming, spoofing, dazzling sensors, cyber attacks against satellite networks, electronic warfare, and possibly more destructive anti-satellite moves if the war widened. America and its allies would try to preserve space-based surveillance and communications while denying China the same advantage. The risk is escalation by dependency. If one side believes satellites are enabling strikes that could decide the war, satellites become targets. But attacking satellites can create debris, threaten civilian systems, and widen the conflict beyond the immediate theater. Space warfare looks clean from the ground until the consequences begin falling across every user of orbit. GPS disruption alone would be felt by militaries, ships, aircraft, financial systems, and logistics networks. Satellite communications disruption would affect deployed forces and civilian resilience. Commercial satellite imagery would become part of the war, as governments, companies, and open-source analysts track events almost in real time. This would make secrecy harder and escalation faster. In previous eras, governments could hide deployments more easily. In 2027, the world might watch invasion fleets assemble from space before the official explanations catch up. That visibility is stabilizing in one sense and destabilizing in another. It makes surprise harder, but it also makes retreat harder. Once the world sees a fleet, a missile launch, or a burning port, leaders become trapped by their own public posture. The Taiwan War would therefore not be fought only across beaches, skies, and seas. It would be fought through the infrastructure that lets modern civilization know where things are. Nuclear risks. The nuclear risk in a Taiwan war would not begin with a planned nuclear exchange. It would begin with fear of conventional defeat, fear of regime humiliation, fear of American escalation, and fear that the other side is preparing something worse. China's nuclear arsenal has been expanding, with assessments pointing to a force that already exceeded 600 operational warheads by the mid-2020s and was expected to keep growing toward 2030. This does not mean nuclear war is likely. It does mean a US-China conflict in 2027 would unfold under a much heavier nuclear shadow than past Taiwan crises. The most dangerous moment would come if China's invasion began failing while American strikes were degrading Chinese naval, missile, or command assets. Beijing could fear that Washington was not merely defending Taiwan, but trying to cripple Chinese power. Washington could fear that China was preparing escalation to force America back. Guam would matter. Japan would matter. Chinese missile forces would matter. American submarines would matter. Strategic bombers would matter. Nuclear signals could be sent through exercises, dispersals, alerts, public warnings, or missile tests. Each signal would be intended to control escalation. Each signal could also intensify it. The nightmare is not that either side wakes up wanting nuclear war. The nightmare is that both sides convince themselves that a limited signal is necessary to prevent defeat, and the other side interprets that signal as preparation for something larger. Taiwan is therefore not only an invasion scenario, it is a ladder scenario. Blockade, missile strikes, amphibious landings, US intervention, Japanese support, base attacks, cyber disruption, base warfare, strategic signaling, nuclear alerting. The world would spend the crisis asking one question: where does the ladder end? The new Cold War. By December 2027, even if the invasion failed, the world would not return to the old normal. A Taiwan war would permanently reorganize global politics. If Taiwan survived, it would emerge battered but symbolically enormous. It would become the island that resisted a superpower. Its democracy would be mythologized. Its military would be rebuilt. Its society would carry trauma. Its economy would need rescue. Its strategic value would become even clearer than before. If China failed, Xi's position would face severe pressure. The Communist Party could respond with repression, purges, nationalism, and deeper militarization. A failed invasion would not necessarily make China more liberal or less dangerous. It could make China angrier, more closed, and more determined to prevent a second humiliation. If China succeeded, the consequences would be even larger. Beijing would break the first island chain, gain a strategic position facing the wider Pacific, absorb Taiwan's population under coercive rule, and potentially gain leverage over parts of the semiconductor ecosystem, even if the most advanced facilities were damaged, disabled, or denied. The psychological effect across Asia would be massive. The United States would face a credibility crisis if it failed to save Taiwan, or a military recovery crisis if it did. Japan would accelerate rearmament. South Korea would reconsider its exposure. Australia would harden its defense posture. The Philippines would become more strategically important. Europe would be forced to decide whether China was still merely a trade partner or now a systemic adversary in a harder sense. The global economy would split faster. Supply chains would be rebuilt around trust, not just cost. Technology blocks would harden. Export controls would expand. Capital markets would punish exposure. Universities, labs, and companies would face new restrictions. The dream of a single integrated global technology economy would look naive. This would be the new Cold War, but not a copy of the old one. The Soviet Union was never the factory of the world. China is. The old Cold War divided ideology, territory, and military alliances. The new one would divide chips, batteries, ports, cloud infrastructure, rare earths, AI models, shipping lanes, payment systems, and data flows. The battlefield would extend into every warehouse, phone, factory, server farm, and investment portfolio. Winners and losers. The immediate losers would be Taiwan's civilians. that must not be lost beneath the grand strategy. A Taiwan invasion would mean missile strikes, blackouts, displacement, fear, mobilization, deaths, shortages, and the possible destruction of one of Asia's most successful democratic societies. China would also lose. Even if it gained territory, it would face sanctions, capital flight, trade disruption, military losses, diplomatic isolation from advanced democracies, and a long-term collapse in trust. An invasion might satisfy nationalist ambition while damaging the economic foundations that helped create Chinese power in the first place. The United States could win militarily and still lose strategically if the cost were too high. Lost ships, aircraft, and personnel would reshape American politics. A damaged Pacific force would affect deterrence elsewhere. Rivals would watch. Allies would calculate. Victory in the Taiwan Strait could still leave America weakened for years. Japan could become one of the central strategic winners in the long run, but only by accepting new danger. A Taiwan war would likely accelerate Japan's transformation into a more normal military power. That may strengthen deterrence, but it would also make Japan a more explicit target in future Asian crises. India, Vietnam, Mexico, parts of Eastern Europe, and other manufacturing alternatives could gain from accelerated supply chain relocation, but they would inherit opportunity from disaster. The companies that diversify before the crisis would look visionary. The companies that wait would look reckless. The semiconductor winners would be those with capacity outside the war zone, but nobody would truly escape. American, Japanese, South Korean, and European chip investments would become more urgent, more subsidized, and more strategic. Yet advanced semiconductor ecosystems take time. The world cannot instantly replace Taiwan because Taiwan is not just a factory site. It is decades of accumulated precision. The biggest loser would be globalization as a belief system. The old promise was that trade would make war too expensive. A Taiwan invasion would prove something darker. Trade can make war so expensive that everyone fears it, but not necessarily so expensive that nobody starts it. The most likely outcome of a 2027 Taiwan invasion attempt is not a clean Chinese conquest. It is a catastrophic, contested, globally destabilizing conflict whose result would depend on speed, surprise, Taiwanese resilience, American decision-making, Japanese support, Chinese logistics, and whether escalation can be contained. A full amphibious invasion would be extraordinarily difficult. China has been preparing, but Taiwan has geography, defensive motivation, and potential outside support. The United States and Japan would have strong reasons to prevent Taiwan's fall, but intervention would carry severe military and nuclear risks. That is why Beijing may prefer blockade, quarantine, cyber coercion, missile intimidation, or a limited seizure before risking a maximal landing. The most plausible first move is therefore not necessarily thousands of troops storming beaches at dawn. It is coercion designed to look less than war until Taiwan's options narrow. A blockade could be framed as law enforcement. Missile exercises could become exclusion zones. Cyber disruption could be blamed on uncertainty. Economic pressure could be presented as punishment rather than invasion. But coercion can fail. Taiwan may refuse to bend. America may intervene earlier than expected. Japan may provide more support than Beijing assumes. Markets may crash faster than China can manage. National pride may trap leaders on every side. If China invades and fails, the world enters a colder, more militarized age with Taiwan damaged, but alive. If China invades and succeeds, the balance of power in Asia changes for a generation. If the war escalates into direct US-China conflict, the global economy suffers a shock that could dwarf recent crises. That is why the Taiwan scenario is so dangerous. It is not one crisis. It is many crises stacked together: military, economic, technological, cyber, maritime, political, and nuclear. The island is small enough to be imagined as local, but important enough to make the whole system tremble. The world is standing on a fault line because Taiwan is where the 21st century's deepest dependencies meet: American power, Chinese ambition, Japanese security, global trade, advanced chips, democratic identity, and the machinery of modern life. If that fault line breaks, the shock will not stay in the Pacific. It will move through markets, factories, ports, phones, satellites, parliaments, and homes. Taiwan may be the most economically important island in human history.